Welcome to Deciphering Growth, the show that explores mental health from every angle. We bring you conversations with personal opinions, stories, and practical tips. We aim to break down the stigma and help you live your best life. So please sit back and let's dive in. Before we begin, we want to remind our listeners that this podcast represents the opinions of Tiffany Graves, Eric Stone, and the show's guests. The content here should not be used as medical advice. It is for informational purposes only, and please consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions. Views and opinions expressed in the podcast are our own and do not represent that of our places of work. This podcast should not be in any legal capacity whatsoever, including but not limited to establishing a standard of care in a legal sense or as a basis for expert witness testimony. There is no guarantee regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast. In no way does listening, reading, emailing, or interacting on social media with our content establish a doctor-patient relationship.
Good day to everyone. Welcome to another episode of Deciphering Growth. I am our somewhat respectful host, Eric Stone, and I am with my colleague who is esteemed Tiffany Grace, talking about religious trauma again today. So for those of you who tuned in for the last episode, we just kind of talked about defining spiritual trauma, religious trauma, and just some different things that could qualify as experiences for those, or how we could maybe define those things. So if you're more interested in that type of thing, make sure to check out that episode. Today, though, we're going to talk a little bit more about treatments we, Tiffany and I as therapists, will use to support someone or work to heal some of the wounds of religious trauma. Tiffany, anything you want to start us with today?
I think the biggest thing I want us to keep in mind is there are more than just the ways that we're going to touch on today to address religious trauma and all the aspects that it shows up in. And we're not trying to say one particular way is better than another way or a combination of ways.
Absolutely. So, as therapists, I know I can speak for myself, but also that we see a lot of religious trauma. But I would just share not every therapist may specialize in something like this, or I think most therapists know what religious trauma or spiritual trauma is, Tiffany. But I think honestly, depending on who you went to, you make it a different approach and different way of being interacted with. So one of the things that we talk about in therapy that I don't think we've talked about in an episode here is, as therapists, we are obligated through our licenses to provide evidence-based treatment. So that is the very short version of that is providing interventions and treatments that have research and data to back them, so that we're not, just maybe some memes of therapists I think are funny, where we're throwing books at people or coping skill this, coping skill that. That we have a set of protocols and goals and interventions to kind of go over. So today we're going to highlight a little bit some of the treatment options that are specific to that, working with spiritual and religious trauma, but also we're going to kind of dive into maybe how Tiffany and I actually work one-on-one with people, because I think it's more interesting to kind of get that little peek behind the scenes. So let me dive in. The gold standard of therapy, and for my therapist friends listening, I'm sure you already know where we're going. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. It has been the gold standard for quite some time, and one of the reasons is that there is so much research and evidence showing that CBT is a helpful treatment and evidence-based treatment for anything from PTSD to anxiety to depression to OCD behaviors to, I'm not going to say everything, but it has been it is the most researched therapy modality by far, even within certain modulations or different identities. CBT is one of those things that all of us therapists are aware of and use in some capacity. Tiffany, what are your thoughts on CBT, or anything you would add with that definition?
Yeah, CBT, I love it. I use it all the time. Uh, I use it a little bit more in tandem with some neuroscience background and helping people understand the brain functions outside of just like how your behaviors and patterns can influence your actions. Really kind of get in there and look at like the neuron responses and things of that nature,
Mm.
and really how like controllable and or not controllable some of those things really are.
Yeah, no, I appreciate how you said that. So yeah, I would say all of these modalities, they're gonna probably have little pieces that other therapists are kind of pulling from to use. It would be very peculiar and strange if one therapist said I only use one modality fully and I don't use anything else. And so just what that would mean is like I'm not pulling a dialectical behavioral thinking worksheet, which is DBT. I'm not going to use my EMDR grounding skill. Like, so it just, I would, there's probably a few out there. And if you're listening, please let us know why. I would love to hear the rationale for only using one modality for everything. But with CBT, I think my favorite intervention with this is there's a worksheet on Socratic questioning. And I really love this worksheet. I go over it a lot with clients. And if you've never used that, the quick version of it is it's just a list of questions you can ask yourself to kind of see what is underneath the maybe the thought or emotion you're having. So maybe the thoughts like my friends hate me. It is a list of questions you start going over in therapy, but then could go over outside of therapy. So if we're using something like that for religious trauma, a very common belief that comes with this, it's all my fault. I don't belong there. I was never enough. That could be a thought to work through in therapy. And just to be very specific, this would not be the only intervention we would use. We would be using lots of different things to get at this. So I don't want anyone to think, well, I can think that thought. Why am I not air quotes cured? It's something we use alongside many other things. Kind of like if you broke your arm, you wouldn't just go and get a cast on. There'd be lots of other steps like, keeping the cast out of water, all those things. So just we wouldn't ever just use one thing. Very rarely is it going to be just a one-off type thing, and that's it. Anything you'd add to that, Tiffany, on CBT?
Yeah, I always compare it to a salad. Like, sure, we can have a
Hmm.
salad if we have lettuce, we can call it a, air quote salad. But like, there are so many different components that like make up CBT and that we can add to CBT to make it more effective and impactful. So like, if we're using a salad metaphor, we could add bacon bits, we could add cheese, we could add, walnuts or raisins, different types of lettuce so that we can really get in there
Mm.
and use different techniques with the basis of like cognitive behavioral therapy to really kind of process through things. It doesn't have to be like a black and white worksheet, like this is how it goes type of thing.
Yeah, I used to hate CBT. I'm going to tell on myself. I knew I had to use it for school. And if any of my grad school professors, for whatever reason, are listening to this, one, thank you so much. That's so kind. And two, I'm really sorry. But when I was going through school, I hated CBT. I was like, oh, like it's so rigid and I'm a free spirit. You got to let me fly. I messed up the quote, but that's how I felt. But then I went to a really great training on CBT hosted by Star Behavioral Health Providers, which is like Better Mental Health Services. And man, they taught me so many practical ways of using it. And then once I knew how to use CBT, I was like, oh my gosh, it's great. And some of the things the trainers would talk about is it's not meant to be regimented. It's just like any other therapy intervention. You use pieces of it, you try. Um, Now, there's different settings like the VA where it is going to be a lot more regimented, not as much flexibility, but I enjoyed the training because it helped me know how to use it a lot better. So I almost felt like it was a tool I didn't know how to use the right way. So once I knew how to use it the right way, oh man, I could do a lot better with that.
Yeah, it is a very versatile tool.
Uh, what do you think is the biggest misperception, Tiffany, that clients have when you're working from CBT?
Ugh, that we're going to spend the entire session doing worksheets or simply talking about like behaviors and how they have to implement new habits to change behaviors. Like it's going to be a very like regimented, like do as I say kind of session. And I'm like, that's not what how therapy works. Like my job's not to tell you what to do. It's to give you insight into like
No.
what is fueling your behaviors so that you can make appropriate
Yeah.
changes that you feel make sense within your life.
Yeah, some of my clients will give me the hardest eye rolls when I use some of my CBT interventions, but they roll their eyes because it's almost like I know when I've been in therapy, I have like my therapist voice in my head of like what they would probably say, and so it's kind of like the there's something really profound about the humanness of therapy. There's another human on the other side, and having those things, but also prompting the questions, kind of steering because that outside lens is very helpful. And so that would be where CBT comes involved. So if you were someone with a religious or spiritual trauma or experience that would qualify for those, CBT could look like maybe exploring different pieces of the feeling or the energy that you are experiencing or carrying, or maybe just noticing or feeling is present. One of the other modalities that I wanted to specifically mention that I'm a very big geek about is eye movement and desensitization and reprocessing therapy, otherwise known as EMDR. My favorite thing that happens for EMDR is when people call it EMD or EDM, like dance music, like it's like, which I think sounds very fun. I would argue EMDR can be just as fun because it allows for healing from traumatic experiences. So the long and short of EMDR is providing your brain some bilateral stimulation, which means we're trying to engage both sides of the brain. That is an experience that one has when they are in REM sleep. And so when one of the things I think is so profound is Francine Shapiro literally went for a walk one day working on her dissertation. And she noticed that when she moved her eyes side to side, that was kind of helpful for her. And boy, did she do a lot of research that we for sure don't have time to get all up in today. But she was able to find and create EMDR. And I'm like, man, what a wonderful dissertation. And so EMDR has tons of evidence behind it. It, I would argue, is not as researched as CBT still, but it is a very strong evidence-based treatment for traumatic experiences, negative core beliefs. And so why I wanted to specifically mention that is there seems to be a lot more negative beliefs and shame and guilt and negative thoughts that tend to come with all traumas, but specifically religious and spiritual trauma. It would not be uncommon to hear things say that, you know, my God doesn't love me anymore. I'm worthless. You know, like, you know, my life is over. My life is ruined. I'm an imposter. I'm a fraud. Uh, Again, those could be things to kind of think about. But one of the reasons I really prefer EMDR as a treatment for myself and my clients is you're able to think of something and work through something without having to talk about every single detail and describe every single image. So that is very relieving for some people who do not want to say everything out loud, but want to sit with it. Tiffany, anything you would add to EMDR?
So that's a hard one because while I support EMDR as a modality, I myself don't utilize it. There are aspects I pull from EMDR, such as like when processing trauma, letting people set their own comfort meter of how much information they want to share, they don't want to share. Because I always remind people, like, I don't have to know every gruesome detail of your trauma to help you process it. There's a lot of things that we can do without getting into the weeds of the details. So that is one thing I like to pull from EMDR. But I've heard it's had amazing results. I've heard a lot of good things from it. I have nothing against it, but I can't add a whole lot because I haven't like dipped my toes in that realm yet.
No, that's okay. I would say one of my favorite things is that you can do it in person, of course. They have like these things. Some people they call them, I call them tappers, where like, you know, you can hold them with your hand. There's lighting bars, there's hand movements, but there's also ways that this can be used for telehealth where there's like I use a website called bilateral.io where like people can have tappers and be at their house or just a ball going across their screen, or there's other ways where people don't have to use the app. All this to say, it can be a very helpful experience. And so I just want to throw that out for telehealth because I know some folks feel more comfortable in their own space, especially when we're talking about feeling safe and wanting to talk about things. And that would be true for all the modalities, not just EMDR. So one of the things I would maybe just shift to a little bit, probably I've got two more, Tiffany, I'll probably get a little more into, but one of those is DBT. And so I've already kind of mentioned it today, dialectical behavioral therapy. It is just it's very similar to CBT, but there's a lot more mindfulness and just principles of like awareness and coping skills and really trying to learn acceptance as a part of it. So you can't really CBT is I would think more thoughts, behaviors, actions. DBT, and I'm not an expert in DBT, so I'm not claiming this, but so if anyone's listening and wants to come in, feel free. But there's this huge component of acceptance. And so why this would be a intervention a therapist could use when we're talking about religious and spiritual trauma is this acceptance of maybe the experiences you've gone through and maybe how to manage those feelings as they come up. Uh, Tiffany, anything you would throw in for DBT?
Yeah, so I think the dear man and the accepts principles. And those are oh my gosh, what is the word I'm looking for where you make a word out of like different steps?
You make anagram? Is that oh man.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I
I
was
was like,
like,
oh my
I
gosh, my
got
brain is
you.
like
This
freezing.
is what 2 cups of coffee will get you, everyone.
Yeah, so they're anagrams for different skills, and they're really focused on helping people like accept situations, um, you know, and then kind of grounding themselves and how they want to move forward in that situation. So I do actually have a deck of DBT coping skills that I use for people as coping skills, like to help them when you're typical, like just breathe exercises
Mm.
don't work because they don't work for everyone. Everyone has very different coping skills they're going to need for their lifestyles.
Yeah, I do like there's different like skill workbooks. There are for CBT as well. I just have found the DBT one to be more helpful for my neuro spicy clients who maybe need like very practical do this, do this. Not because
Yes.
it's restrictive, but just because it's like it's very hard for a lot of people to be like, okay, I'm gonna breathe. Now
Oh
what?
yeah.
I
Yeah.
got that question. I was like, now what do I do? And it's like, okay, so if you're
Uh,
listening, you're not alone. I remember the first time I did
it's
a
such a it's such a call out because there's so many times when I'm sitting with my clients and I have to like give a disclosure or a statement of like, now I'm going to give you this breathing exercise. However, like it may or may not work for you. I can't tell you how effective it's going to be because I hate breathing exercises because they don't work for me. um because I can't the idea of sitting and just focusing on my breath and I'm like my brain is like this is dumb. I need to go do other things. And having those like do this, my brain is like, "Oh, I have a task I need to go do." Like it's so much easier to use the DBT skills.
I do think the DBT skills are just a lot more flexible. Like for I don't know. I think they have some real life I think CBT can. I think you just have to make sure you're preparing clients and yourself of how you're going to use those skills versus I think DBT, it's almost a component of that is built in of how are you going to use it. So I find it interesting. I just got one more, and I know there's probably more, Tiffany, but I just got one more I want to talk about. So this is one that is near and dear to my heart. It's called faith-based therapy. So I want to give like it's just a some specifiers around this. So this is not. I noticed I didn't say Christian therapy. I didn't say like faith-based therapy would be therapy where your religious or spiritual beliefs are incorporated as a part of your treatment. So I would say 96% of therapists already do this. So, a very common question on intake is, do you have any spiritual religious beliefs? If so, what are they? Exploring with clients. So, and I would just throw out some folks I could feel listening could maybe check out and say, yeah, you're supposed to say that. So I am a Christian and have grown up in that culture. And one of the things I would just throw out in that space is there is like this conspiracy that therapists want to convert people outside of their faith. So almost like if you're a Christian and you go to therapy, a lot of circles, there's this belief that, if it's not a Christian therapist, they will try to convince you of your beliefs. Just so everyone is aware, if that actually was happening, therapists would lose their licenses. We are not allowed to pitch clients to switch their religions or things. And just from a like pragmatic standpoint, it kind of makes sense if you're coming in and you want help on something, you really don't want someone to try to be like, oh, by the way, come to my church cookout or type of thing. So I don't always talk about that part of the journey because there is a lot of pain and harm that's been done. Specifically, we talk about religious and spiritual trauma by those in religious bodies. However, I want to just give a shout out. I think a lot of people are trying to heal those wounds, like we kind of mentioned in the last episode. And so I just bring this up to say, um, if you are someone and maybe you're like a Christian or maybe you're Jewish and you have your beliefs, but you're not really sure what it is, if you bring that up in therapy, no one is going to really, almost no one is going to try to steer. I'm not going to say no one will. That's a very normal part of the experience. And obviously, you have to be safe to talk about things that are so vulnerable. And so important. So, why I bring that up is that it can be a very helpful space to kind of incorporate your religious beliefs and sort through them. So, Tiffany, I just want to open it up to you. Any thoughts on anything I've said so far with that one?
Yeah, so that's one that I feel a little prickly towards. Um,
Mhm.
I was raised very strict Catholic. I do not practice any religion at this point. More of a
Yeah,
spirituality realm type person. That being said, like I do have clients of all different faiths because their faith doesn't impact the work because they're not coming to me to work on faith related things. Um,
yeah,
and everyone is allowed to have like their faithful journey, whatever that may look like for each individual. And spiritually based therapy like can be super effective for many individuals. It's a great modality, but I personally I
yeah,
like for me it's like one
yeah.
of those prickly of like I get it, it works, but I don't want it in my realm.
Yeah, no, and that's I think Tiffany, I appreciate your honesty and there's no right or wrong answer to that and no one set way any of us should be thinking or believing. So appreciate your honesty and I think, that's one of the things where like people are usually looking for different types. So someone may I jokingly have called it Christianese. So I speak Christianese. I kind of know what may come up with those topics, or if someone says I hear the voice of God, I know that they're not having a hallucination. They're talking about a spiritual, religious experience. Uh, but one of the things I would just throw out, because I don't know if everyone knows this, I think us therapists know, a lot of times those beliefs can be a protective factor when we're talking about things like self harm or just really almost any outcome. So there are a lot of positive potentials there, but also wounds. So one of the things too is someone may find using faith-based or spiritual counseling very triggering and overwhelming and not helpful. And then for other folks, that may be something that they want to use as a way of approaching it. But honestly, it's okay if you don't know. You may just approach that with the therapist you're working with or counselor. Um, I do want to just distinguish this though, that there are specific religious interventions that someone used, but I would not call those spiritual or faith-based counseling because that, to me, and maybe someone disagrees, uh, is incorporating clients' beliefs and working with them and adding. Like if you're seeking Christian therapy, that to me specifies or like biblical counseling. Like that is where it's like, okay, we're going to tie a lot of things into Bible verses or the Bible or very specific. So I would say spiritual counseling is kind of like open, very like, and then if you're looking for specific, which is okay, that would be different. So just, if you're looking at therapists and see that, so some people want that, some people do not, and I respect both of those. But I do just want to distinguish that because I see those as very different things. So I wouldn't say I do Christian counseling. I wouldn't. I would say I do spiritual counseling, and I'm familiar with the culture and belief system I grew up in, but I would not label that. There are people that do it though, and I'm not trying to talk um, disparaging about it. I think it can be helpful for some people and um, you know, we all gotta start with what we feel most comfortable.
Yeah, I appreciate you making that distinguishing those because like I know that's something that I often see of like I do spiritual counseling or I do Christian counseling or I do religious counseling and I'm like, ugh, if I ever wanted to explore this, like where's the
Uh,
realm? So I appreciate like clarifying like those and that like spiritual counseling is very different from like a specific religion based counseling.
yeah, I think things can help other people, but sometimes, and I think I've had to work through this myself and we won't go on it, but I know like I work a lot with LGBTQ plus clients. And so one of the things I have to be mindful of is like, okay, it says Christian and it says that. that for sure is probably going to trigger someone. And if we don't get a chance to have a conversation or get to know each other, they may not know what that means or what that looks like because of wounds. But one of the things I would just throw out is like, if you're looking for therapy, find what feels like the best fit for yourself, and I honor your intuition. But one of the best things I think any of us therapists can do is have those consults for us as the therapist to make sure we're doing the right work with someone, but also so someone and you get a feel and you haven't invested an hour, you've invested a couple emails in 10 minutes, and like that's what you've invested. No more, no less.
Mhm. Yeah. And then that just plays into the diversity of like the counseling field. Like we all have different modalities, we all have different backgrounds and different approaches, and that's kind of the reason some of us are so niche down.
Yeah, I love that. There's definitely I joke, there's my favorite TikToker, I should get his name right, but he goes with the green or red flag and he waves it and he runs around. And I think, but one of the giant red flags I've joked about with other therapists is if you have a therapist that says they literally do everything or specialize in everything, that should just be the biggest red flag because it's like almost like if you went to I don't know, like a surgeon and they said, I do all surgery. It would just, there's things we can all kind of probably help with, but really there's certain things we should not all be doing everything. It's hard to keep those skills as sharp as necessary. Tiffany, as far as therapy modalities, is there any other therapy modalities you wanted to discuss or highlight? Those are the ones I just wanted to make sure we went over.
Yeah. Another one that I like to use quite often is narrative therapy. So that really focuses on encouraging individuals to reframe your experiences and create them in such a way that they empower you.
Ooh. So if I came to you as a client and I'm like, I don't know what narrative therapy is, what would a session look like? What would I do?
Yeah, so if we're looking at within the context of like religious trauma, sometimes individuals like see themselves as a product of the church, or like religious entity that they're like trying to get away from, and helping them reframe that in terms of you're not a product. You made choices, or like there were choices that were made for you, that is just a part of who you are, and helping them reframe that they have the choice to like, pick and choose what parts they continue to carry through their life.
Wow. Well, that sounds really profound. I could totally see that being helpful for someone maybe with trauma related to the things we're talking about today. Yeah. So this is probably unexpected, but the other thing I would say is not doing therapy. So I just want to throw out that option that there's so many different ways to heal a wound. So I know there may be some folks, I don't know, like what do you say? But not doing therapy is an option, and also it's more comfortable sometimes to turn to people and are like already known to us. So I know there may be some irony in this, but sometimes talking with maybe it's a former pastor or a former Sunday school teacher or a former someone you went through some of those experiences, maybe they can be a voice of support. So it's not therapy, but maybe they can be there to help you and just validate some of the things you're going through or support. But we have to acknowledge that some folks may not have those options in any of those spaces. So the thing I would just throw out though is just maybe a great question we're kind of screening for when it's like, do I go to therapy or not? Is how disruptive is this to your day to day life? And that may be a question you have to ask the people close around you, but also checking in with yourself. Is it something that takes up most of your time thinking? Is it feel really bound up and it's just showing up in a lot of different places and you're like, oh, yeah, I am a little angry all the time, or oh, my sleep's disturbed, or not going to say what that level needs to be for everyone, but just there's different ways to work on things. And so therapy is an option. Also, therapy doesn't have to be. But I will just make a shameless plug, of course, that I do think in some situations therapy causes the healing to move faster and the insights to come a little quicker. And it can be a helpful, I think, intervention when we're trying to work on some of these things.
Yeah. Well, and also like moving in line with that, for people that like have, negative experiences or just negative thoughts about therapy, or you're not ready to like dip your toe into therapy, there are support groups that are ran by people who are not therapists. There are online support groups. There are very highly moderated Discord channels where people like come together and like check and just have like conversations about what's going on. So if you're looking for something non-traditional or like non-therapeutic, the platforms are out there.
Love that. Yeah. I would say, find the people you feel helpful with. And I'm not gonna share anybody's personal names out here that I talked to, but I will say in my own journey with some of these things, the people in my orbit and circle were really helpful. The people that, we went through some similar experiences, reached out. And it's been very helpful. Or finding people in my own life that maybe weren't in the exact same things, but have things they can pull from and then kind of talk about. But I really love this discussion. We know we're going to continue focusing on this discussion. So, just a little preview is that we're going to dive in a little bit more specifically into the LGBTQ plus populations and some of the religious and spiritual trauma that community is experiencing, and also paths kind of forward and maybe uh, things that are being done to maybe heal some of those wounds and prevent some of those wounds as well. But before we're done, Tiffany, anything you would add?
Ooh, anything I would add? I think one other thing, we didn't touch on a few other modalities that we probably don't use as often, but creative therapy such as art therapy and music therapy can be really helpful for people to have creative outlets so they don't have to speak at all about their religious trauma. It becomes more of like a verbal or a musical expression of like what they're experiencing.
Yeah, it's hard to include everything, so hopefully, the way we're breaking this up is helpful. But thank you for those who have been giving us some feedback. We're really excited to continue these impactful and yet we know very hard conversations. So, we said it the last time, but if you ever just want to skip an episode, it's all good. We really appreciate you being here. And also, you have to protect your mental health, and that may include just skipping a mental health podcast. So, wherever you're at in that journey, we hope to connect with you and support you as best you can. But thank you for listening and supporting us however you can. One of the things, if you're looking for some of the free resources, is we do have our Patreon page. It is completely free. There are some extra episodes that Tiffany and I have put on there. We also have collected all of the resources that we mentioned on the podcast and also from our guests. So if you're looking for some of the things we've talked about today, please feel free to check it out. And I guess truly then that would be the last thing I have to think.
Yeah, so with that being said, next time me and Eric are gonna kind of dive into the cultural sensitivities and intersectionality. Big words are hard, guys. Within religious trauma and things of that nature. But until then, we hope you guys have wonderful days ahead of you until next time.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Deciphering Growth. We hope you found our conversation helpful and insightful. Subscribe to our podcast for more episodes and check out our Patreon for more content. Don't hesitate to contact us on social media if you have any questions or comments. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep growing.